So I decided I needed to focus on the big shows because that's where I was getting the most response. And so I started doing some research, and first thing I did was I called the people back at RTIR and I said, hey, you guys have a database of all the radio stations because, I mean, you obviously do because you mail your magazine out to them. Can I get a copy of that, A? And B, can I tell the big stations from the little stations if I do? And they said yes and yes. And I said, great, there's my last credit card. And so we did the transaction. So I worked with that for a couple of months, and I found out a couple of things that I want to share with you because I think you'll find them valuable if you decide to go down this path of doing radio. So the first thing is that they told me that you could tell the size of the station by two things: the station's market rankings and the station's wattage. So I want to talk about these real quick. So the station's market rankings are basically the size of the city the station broadcasting. So New York's number 1, LA's number 2, Chicago's number 3, so on and so forth. So what that means is every single radio station, let's say in New York, in the greater New York metro area that has a transmitter anywhere in New York, gets to say that it has a number 1 market ranking. That goes all the way from WABC, with 3 million listeners, down to the Polka station with not enough people to fill your garage. So market rankings don't tell you what you really want to know, which is how many people are listening. It only tells you that it's broadcasting in a big city. So I turn my attention to the wattage. Now wattage is basically how big is the signal? How far does the station reach? How far away can you hear it from? And you probably heard like 50,000 watt stations, 100,000 watt stations, that's a big station, right? Lots of listeners, right? Here's what happens. In the big cities, LA, New York, Chicago, so on and so forth, the FCC, there's so many stations on the dial. All of you who live in big cities, those of you who live in Chicago know, you go down the dial, there's a radio station at every notch. Okay? So if the FCC gave out 50,000 watts or 100,000 watts to every single station, you'd hear nothing but static on the dial. They'd all bleed over into each other. So in the bigger cities, they give them less wattage. And out in the middle of nowhere, they give them more wattage. So for example, KBC in Los Angeles only has a tiny little 5,000 watt transmitter. Most of you can spit further than that thing can go. All right? Whereas KBOI in Boise, Idaho has a 50,000 watt transmitter. But KBC has 10 times the listenership. So the market, the station's wattage is actually usually inversely proportional to the number of listeners that the station has. So once I figured that out, I said, okay, well, that's not going to help me. I need to find out what the actual number of listeners is. So I did a little more research, and I found out that there's a company called Arbitron. Anybody heard of Arbitron? They're like Nielsen for television, and they keep track of the ratings and the listener numbers for radio stations. So I got on the phone, and I started calling Arbitron. Well, Arbitron's this big multinational company. They've got offices all over the place. And I probably made a couple of dozen phone calls over a 2-week period of time. And I don't know how I did it, but one Monday morning, I somehow managed to get the vice president of the company on the phone. I think the operator just finally got tired of me calling or accidentally put me through the wrong line or something. So, I had my little spiel down. I said, hey, I was saying, hey, I'm this kid working out of my garage. And I got this little book on how to beat speeding tickets, and I'm trying to get on the big shows, and I understand you guys keep track of listener numbers, and anything you can do to help me. And he says to me, well, Alex, he said, let me explain to you how we work here at Arbitron. We rate 256 markets across the country. We do it 4 times a year, and we charge each one of the stations within each one of those markets somewhere between $5,000 and $25,000 per quarter for their ratings. My little calculator brain is adding this up, going 1 million, 2 million, 3 million. Nope, don't think I can afford that on my garage budget. And so anyway, we're starting to round up our conversation. I finally said to him, I said, listen, obviously I can't afford to buy your ratings for the whole country. I said, is there anything you can do to help me? Any suggestions you have for me? And he said, well, Alex, he said, tell you what. He says, I don't know how you got through to me, but you did. And he said, I think your book is actually pretty cool. As a matter of fact, I have a few friends who could use a copy of it right about now. So I'll tell you what, I'm going to make you a deal. If you send me a dozen copies of your book, I will send you a copy of my last ratings book for the whole country. Whoa. Yeah, that's what I said. And I said, well, and he said, yeah. He said, see, because I've got my brand new one out, and that's the one I'm selling right now. But the old one's only 3 months old, and the ratings don't really change much in 3 months. So for you, for your purposes, it'll be fine. And sure enough, a couple days later, it showed up in the mail. I brought a copy of it with me just because I wanted to show it to you. So I'm going to run over here to this side table where Meredith stashed my stuff, and I'll bring it up here and put it on the stage. It'd be good to have it on a table like right here to set ourselves on. Anyway, so I brought a copy of this. This is the Arbitron Radio USA book right here. It looks like a telephone book. It is 914 pages long, this particular issue. And, wow, they're still after me. I just can't get away. Oh, man, that was great timing. Anyway, so when I got this book, by the way, they'd only print like, I don't know, 50 copies of this thing, because when they sell the ratings to the individual stations, they only sell them by market. This has got all the markets in the whole entire country. So, and they only the top people in the company get copies of this thing. So he sent me this. This is like an inside thing. When I got this, you know how you have those days where your life just changes forever? This was the day for me that just changed my life forever. I went through this book, I picked out every single station in the country that had 100,000 listeners or more. That's what I decided was my cutoff point. And I built myself a database, and I put together a press kit, and I started calling the stations. And I started getting on these shows just left and right. And I was doing 1, 2, 3 shows every morning. And I'm on the West Coast, and the majority of the bigger stations are in the Central and Eastern time zones. So I'd get up at 5, 6 in the morning. I just let the phone wake me up. I'd do the interviews laying in bed. I'd roll over, go back to sleep a lot of times. So I'd do 1, 2, 3 shows every morning. A lot of times I was selling $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 worth of books before I even got out of bed in the morning. Yeah. So the last time I did a count, I had been a guest on 1,264 radio shows. If I would have had to pay for all that airtime, which I got for free, it would have cost me about $4.5 to $5 million. And I ended up selling $1,526,000 of that little garage-produced book on how to beat speeding tickets.